Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel Beth Chats Books. Now today's video is going to be my November wrap up part 2. So these are the rest of the books that I have read and finished in the month of November. So let's just get stuck into the books that I managed to finish in the second half of November. So the first book that I finished was The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abi Dari. Now this is set in Nigeria in 2014 into 2015 and follows Aduni, who is a young girl who really just wants to seek an education and to better herself. She loses her mother and she is living in Nigeria with her father and her 2 brothers in a remote village in Nigeria. And she gets sold into a marriage with an older man because her dad needs the money to feed the rest of his family. From there, we go on an adventure that sees Aduni moving to Lagos, taking up employment and learning what it is to be a Nigerian woman and what it's like growing up when all she really wants is an education, but the political climate, the economic climate, the standing, the culture, there's a lot of really interesting things in here that make it hard for Aduni, even in 2015, to get a good education. And she's a very clever, promising young woman. And The Girl with the Louding Voice references this idea that throughout the book, it's a kind of coming of age narrative in which she learns to find her voice, and the language is really clever in here because Dari writes in a way through the character that we learn as we read more in the book how her language skills and her grasp of English and grammar gets better, but it's written in the vernacular style of a young girl trying to learn English and get better at it. You take care of your children's, you take care of my children's too. Her body's moving, shaking, but her eyeballs wide open, be looking the grey of the sky, seeing only what the spirit can see. So there's probably better examples here, but it's kind of written in the style of somebody who's not learned English as their first language. So she meets some interesting people along the way and she has some interesting friendships and relationships that are empowering that she has with other females. And this is a really interesting story. I really enjoyed it. I was really engaged with it and I really like reading about Nigerian culture. And this is a book about identity and what it means to be a young Nigerian female living in Nigeria in this time period, and still some of the issues and stumbling blocks alongside being a female in Nigeria and trying to get education. But this cover is absolutely stunning and it was brand new from the library. I think I was the first person to take this out, so it's a stunning book, stunning story, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed this one. And then the next one I read is Holding by Graham Norton. Now, this is a very conflicting read and my feelings on this are very conflicted because I love Graham Norton's books. I read A Keeper and I've recently read Homestretch and absolutely loved it. And I saw a lot of the things that I love about Graham Norton's books in this book, which is Graham Norton's debut. But one issue I had with this book was the fat phobia and the representation of a fat character in this novel. Sergeant Collins is the police officer in this area in Dunedin, which is a fictionalised village in Ireland that Graham Norton uses, and he ends up having a bit of a love triangle in this novel with Evelyn, who's one of the 3 sisters who lives on the outskirts of the village, and Brid. It's like a lady who's married and has children and seems content, but she seems to have a bit of a drinking problem and there's a lot of rumours in the village. So a lot of this book is centred around village life, which I love when Graham Norton has this really intimate community and everybody knows everybody. And there was a a farmhand, Tommy, who was having a romance with Evelyn but was engaged to Brid and then disappears. And the novel starts with Collins finding some bones on a piece of land that's a building site where they're creating new buildings. I can't really remember what it was meant to be for, maybe housing. And they investigate, and then the village deliberates whether this could be Tommy's remains because he disappeared all those years ago. But one thing that I just couldn't get past in this novel was how Collins was represented, and it really made me severely uncomfortable. I really hate in TV and media and books the fat shaming culture and the references to somebody's weight and what they're eating. It makes me severely uncomfortable. And I love Graham Norton, and I love his books, and I love him as an author, and I don't want to detract from his books because his other books are fantastic, and there was a lot in this book that I enjoyed, but I think you should be trigger warned that there is fat phobia in this book. I wanted to see past it, and I think we should have representation of all body shapes and sizes in novels, but I don't think this was done with a lot of sensitivity, and I wish that the publishers would have noticed this and would have tried to reframe this. The very first and the very last chapter goes into a lot of detail about his weight, and I find it very, very uncomfortable. So I'm going to see if I can find somewhere where it mentions it. So PJ dabbed a damp finger on the toast crumbs in his lap, brought it to his mouth and sighed. Just gone 11, a good hour and a half till lunch. What day was it? Wednesday. Pork chops. He supposed they'd have the leftover crumble from last night, but then he remembered he had finished that standing in front of the tall fridge just before he went to bed. He blushed slightly as he thought of Mrs. Meany, the housekeeper, finding the bowl in the sink, tutting as she washed it under the hot water while at the same time planning what new confection she could conjure up to tempt him with. He swore that if it weren't for her, he'd be half the size. Sure, a sandwich would do him for his lunch. He didn't need 2 dinners or come to that 2 puddings. He only had the cooked breakfast every morning because she plopped it down in front of him before he could protest. His arm twitched as he imagined slamming the fridge door against her small frame and letting her slump to the floor. No longer able to widen her eyes as she cleared his plate. Well, no need to ask if you enjoyed that, Sergeant. Mrs. O'Driscoll bared her small, neat teeth and laughed. She was being kind, and yet all PJ heard was a woman laughing at a man his size squeezed into the driver's seat and revelling in her own slim figure. She held out the cup and saucer with its cloud of steam. Then her other arm shot out, thrusting a plate with the jam-covered scone up to his face. They're just out the oven, and that's the jam from the rector's wife. You're too good to me, he said with a forced smile. Who knew a simple scone could provoke such a confusion of emotions? Enjoy that now, and don't worry, I'll send Petra out in a minute for the plate. Sure, you'll make short work of it. There was just a lot of references that, reading it, I had a very visceral gut reaction to that just made me very uncomfortable. Sitting alone in a restaurant was something he tried to avoid, the way the other diners looked at him when he walked in. They didn't even try to disguise their amusement and disgust. What did this man want with any more food? The waiter approached him and asked if he'd like any bread and butter. Had PJ imagined the young man was smirking? Yes, please. This was even worse than he'd been expecting. The bread basket with a small ramekin of butter was delivered. That waiter was definitely laughing at him. PJ waited till he had gone and then picked up a piece of bread and spread some of the butter on it. God, it was good. He allowed himself one more piece, then another. Only one slice of bread remained. He would not have it. He wouldn't give the smart-ass waiter the satisfaction of coming back to find the basket stripped of its contents. So it was just constant references to what he was eating and constantly reminding you as a reader he's fat. Oh, he eats a lot. He eats puddings and crumbles and breads and a big cooked breakfast, and he has 2 dinners, and found as a reader that made me really, really uncomfortable and took me out of the story because I've said this numerous times to family and friends, but I don't think somebody's weight should be the most important thing about them, and Graham Norton was trying to get you as a reader to laugh at him. Oh, he's a stupid, fat, overweight buffoon, because there's a lot of references to another sergeant coming in to help him who's from the Dublin police department, and he constantly takes the mickey out of him and says he's slow and he's not getting it. But as a reader, you don't feel that way. I think Collins is quite perceptive, and he's very loving and affectionate, and he's being underutilised here where he is the police officer of a very sleepy village. And I think in some ways Graham Norton tried to redeem himself by allowing Collins to leave the village at the end of the book and go on to greener pastures new, but I just think if that's going to upset you or distress you or piss you off, then maybe skip this one and read some of his others, because I hated those parts of the book. I really, I don't know how to express the level of discomfort I felt, so I only gave this 3 out of 5 stars, because overall it was a good story, and I wish the publishers had just told him to completely rein back on that, and it would have made for a better book overall. And then I read Forever by Judy Blume. So I haven't read any Judy Blume, and I took it out of the library on BorrowBox because I just wanted to see what all the hype was about. I know a lot of young adults grew up on a diet of Judy Blume novels, and so I just wanted to see what the fuss was all about. So I read Forever. And this follows Kath, who starts a romance with Michael. They're having this spring into summer romance before they start their university degrees in separate states, and it goes through the progression of their romance from the very start, and then they spend the last few weeks of summer apart because they both get different summer jobs, and kind of the reality of your first love, the disintegration of that first love, and the complications and the breakup, as well as the romance, is addressed in this novel. I just thought it was such good fun. I found it really readable and compelling, and I definitely would read some of the Judy Blume novels in the future because it was just fun to get immersed in that young adult world of what's going on, who fancies who, and coming to sex and relationships for the first time. And it was very easy to read through and just get lost in. And I think it's important that these kind of books are out there, and this was a book that was published in the 70s, where this whole sexual revolution of the 60s and the 70s about women empowerment and learning about safe sex was relatively new, so this was quite revolutionary, and it definitely stands the test of time. I just had a thoroughly enjoyable time reading it. It was just pure escapism. It's exactly what it says on the tin. It's not really gonna rock your world, but it's just, if you ever need a palate cleanser or you need something to help you change your pace of reading. I know a lot of people go to middle grade or they go to fantasy books to switch things up when they've had a lot of intense literary fiction or classics, or they're a bit burnt out by their thrillers. This is a great book to kind of palate cleanse you, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, so I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. Like I said, nothing amazing, but it was enjoyable. And then I read The Pursuit of Love by Nancy Mitford, which I googled afterwards, and I wanted to know because it's part of a loose series. So I know The Pursuit of Love, Love in a Cold Climate, and Don't Tell Alfred, I believe, are narrated by the same character, which is Fanny, but loosely about different women's stories. So I was googling it, trying to find out which was the next one, which Love in a Cold Climate I've put on reserve at the library to read the next one, because I kind of like, once I've started a series, to finish it. But I realised when I was googling that I think there is going to be an adaptation. I don't know whether it's going on to Netflix or maybe BBC next year in 2021. And I think Lily James is going to be the main character of The Pursuit of Love, the main character that's in, that the whole novel's really focused around, which is Linda. So this follows Fanny, who she is the narrator of the story, and she was raised by an aunt, as her mother seems to drift from meaningless relationship with a man to meaningless relationship with a man, and she doesn't really know anything about her father. So she's raised by an aunt, but every summer she goes to another aunt's house and spends the summer with her cousins, 2 of which, Linda and Louisa, are a similar age to her, and they kind of grow up together. So it starts from them being quite young, and then it gets to where Louise, who's a little bit older than the 2 of them, comes out. She is of age to be married, and she gets married, and then it's about Fanny and Linda finding love, and Linda doesn't tend to have a very successful time of it with finding a partner, so she ends up having a few husbands, and there's a bit of a drama that ensues. And Linda's an effervescent character. It seems like everybody in the novel, Fanny included, kind of from her viewpoint, everybody falls in love with her, and she's a bit like a moth to the flame. She can't help but get herself into these situations. And while Fanny and Louisa go down the traditional route, marry a man and have a lot of children and are being seen to be good wives, Linda doesn't follow the same path, and it's the consequences of that. And this is also in the background of the Second World War, the kind of end of the Second World War, and where that leaves the upper classes in the UK. This is kind of centred around the Cotswolds and makes reference to London. So it's a really interesting look at that point of view and society and the class system and the outlook post-war in the UK. But it also has a very compelling storyline. So I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. I found that Linda was a very interesting character and somebody that you could spend a lot of time thinking about and analysing, and her position, especially because she was living in a conservative period of time, and with the inflection of being a reader of the modern world and of the 2020 era that we're living in now, whether a lot of the choices that Linda made were quite as scandalous as they were perceived to have been. So with this adaptation coming out next year, it'll be really interesting to see how that's portrayed. And I'm obviously going to read the next one, which is Love in a Cold Climate, but I think Fanny's also narrating that one. But I don't think it's anything to do with that family that we've met in The Pursuit of Love. I think it's a different cousin or family relation to Fanny herself, so it will be from her perspective, but about a completely different set of characters. So I'm interested to see how that will pan out. And then I literally finished this yesterday, which is How Much of These Hills Is Gold by C. Pam Zhang. Now this was really, really interesting. So while it's quite short, it's 271 pages, the pacing of this novel is very slow, and I think that's due to the form and structure of the book. So there is a lot of page breaks, if you can see. I'll try and get a better example, it's not as good. A lot of page breaks, and then there's a lot of cutting to different parts of the story in which we get perspectives from characters in the past, and they're also quite short chapters, but the language and the writing is very lyrical and very meditative and very tranquil, that this doesn't have a tangible plot and it doesn't go in a linear plot heavy fashion, and the language is very reflective. So that actually my reading of this was a lot slower than I anticipated, but it was because the language was so beautiful, the imagery was so visceral and bold on the page that you really felt like you were there with these two characters. I almost wanted to take my time with it, so I wouldn't say it's a bad thing, but the pace overall of this novel is a lot slower. So this follows two sisters, Sam and Lucy, who live in the US. Their mother was a Chinese immigrant who moved over to the US, and she met their father. So Bar and Ma, we learn a little bit about their history, how they came to America, and how they came with the promise of finding gold in the hills, and they wanted to live the American dream. And then the consequences of those decisions and where that leads them in their lives, and then we go from there in the novel to Sam and Lucy, two siblings, and how they traverse this new land, this new identity, in a world without their parents, and the consequences and where their life decisions lead them. Which doesn't sound like much of a plot, but the way that this is written, you completely submit yourself to this world. It is written with such a richness, such a patience and a talent that it's absolutely stunning. There's no really cohesive and great way to explain this novel. I found that I was interested in all elements of this novel. Usually on paper this shouldn't be a novel that I would enjoy because I don't really like westerns and I don't like books without any propelling plot. Recent books I haven't enjoyed that I've kind of dealt with lack of plot are things like The Shadow King and novels where they usually travel across, for example the second half of Lost Children Archives where they're travelling across a desert land. Those are usually things that I don't like, but this really isn't a travel novel, and westerns usually are a travel novel. It does deal a lot with the characters travelling to different places, but it isn't giving you that, what I deem as less interesting part of them camping up and sleeping rough and things like that, things that don't really compel me. This is an epic in miniature. This is going through the history of their Chinese identity and roots and bringing that to the US and this culture clash, and about their youth and about their parents' relationship, and it's just very visceral, the language, so that every little chapter is taking you somewhere else, and so you feel like you've learnt a lot about these characters, like that epic history is being given to you but in a very short amount of time and pages. So Sipam Zhang is a very talented writer to be able to give you so much in such a little amount of pages and words. For example, as I've shown you, there's not a huge amount of text on the page, but yet you really feel like you've gone through the history of this family, but in an engaging way. It's not too exhausting, you're not trudging through it and losing interest. So that's where I'm going to kind of stop talking about it, because I don't think I'm going to do it justice, and I know a lot of people have loved this book and articulated their thoughts much better than I have. For example, Simon over at Savage Reads really loved this book and said, for people who don't like westerns, try this book and see if you'll enjoy it, because he didn't think he would like westerns and then ended up loving this book. And I'm really glad he has promoted this book and told everybody how fantastic it is, because this isn't something that I would pick up and enjoy based on the synopsis and again in that western feel, but absolutely loved it. Completely has changed my mind on this kind of narrative, and I know a lot of people have raved about Lonesome Dove and said that that's a fantastic western that people who don't like westerns will love, and in the acknowledgements Sipam Zhang has mentioned how that was an inspiration for this novel. So I think I might go and read that and see if I can be swayed again with this genre. But overall, just stunning, this book. So I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I don't know whether that will increase to maybe 4.5 if I reflect on it at the end of the year and feel a little bit more fondly. But I think because it was a slower pace, it took me over a week to read this book, which it shouldn't have done based on the page numbers. 270 pages is usually quite easy for me to devour. So I don't know, for now I'm happy for it to sit at 4 out of 5 stars. So there's that one. Then the last one that I read was Open Water by Caleb Azuma Nelson. And this is published by Penguin UK, and I was given a review copy on NetGalley, an ebook of this novel. So this follows 2 unnamed characters, 2 black artists living in London, a man and a woman, and the woman eventually moves to Dublin and studies there, and it's really about their relationship. So again, this is another novel that doesn't really have a tangible plot. I think if you enjoy Sally Rooney's Normal People, then you will really love this novel, because it deals with a similar type of story. It's about an intimate relationship between 2 people, about the will they won't they element of that relationship, and then the complications that arise from that relationship. So what Sally Rooney did really well with Connell and Marianne's story is the idea that even when they got together, it wasn't the straightforward love story, and a lot of romance and literary fiction deals with the end result being them getting together and that's what hinges the whole novel. But Sally Rooney really broke the mould with normal people by showing that once the relationship starts, the complications and the issues don't stop, and that relationships are complex, and this novel is very similar. The two characters keep misunderstanding each other, they can't express their feelings for each other in an adequate way. There's complications when they start the relationship, but also what I found really interesting and really powerful about this novel is that we learn a lot from the perspective of the male character and about his black identity as a male, his issues with toxic masculinity, and the way that he feels about being vulnerable. So what I loved in this novel is it mentions a lot about things like grief and loss and how the character would express those emotions through crying or expressing it in an emotional way, which surprisingly is not expressed in literature very often, particularly a male black protagonist showing his emotions by crying about the loss of grandparents, or about him feeling overwhelmed emotionally and not being able to articulate that to his loved ones and to the female protagonist. I found that so refreshing, but also I loved that this book ultimately is a love letter to the black community and the black British community and what it means to be black and British in 2020. And there was references to James Baldwin's novels, Zadie Smith's novels, Dizzy Rascal the rapper, and this brimming sense of identity embedded in black culture, which a lot of novels again are white centric, and this was a love letter to being black, to living in London, to having that identity. And it's a really raw depiction of the complications of when you are going through emotional periods in your life and learning to trust and express, and ultimately the miscommunication between what you try and preserve for your own sense of self and for survival, and how that affects the relationships that you have with your loved ones. So I just think it was stunning. I loved these characters. I didn't want to leave these characters. I got that sense when I read Normal People, but I just loved how this really is something new and interesting and fresh, and this author will be going places. This was a fantastic debut. This name will be known. Wholeheartedly, I believe that this will blow up, this book, because it's also perfectly within its moment with the Black Lives Matter movement and how that's swept from the US to the UK and what it means to be black. And also what this beautifully shows is that there is a preconception and entrenched in racism that the black community must be really strong to empower themselves and not show vulnerability, and this novel tackles black vulnerability in a really beautiful way, and it's reshaping the mould of how we judge other cultures and communities, and these perceptions and these false judgments and this false pressure that's placed on a community or a culture to be strong and bold, when vulnerability within these two characters are what make them so accessible and likeable and lovable. And we need to get rid of these outdated perceptions of empowerment. Vulnerability can be empowering. And yeah, you could just go off on this. There's so much here in this. Is again a very short novel. This just is brimming to the top with so many really important themes right now. Loved it. So again, I gave that 4 out of 5 stars. And again, I'm not really sure whether it will be bumped up to a 4.5, but I'm happy with where that is. So they're all the books that I finished in November. I will be showing you some books that I read in December as I get round to reading them. It'll be the end of my library books because I've got them now till January, and some more NetGalley books. But I'm also hoping that next time you guys see a video from me, I will have my TBR trolleys up so I relented and bought some TBR trolleys because I saw them all over Instagram and I thought, I've got books all over my floors, so I really want to put them in a trolley, and that might help me visualise my TBR. So I'm hopefully going to do a TBR trolley video once they're all up, and do that before obviously my December wrap up and show you what I might be reading in December. But anyway, I've waffled for too long, so thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.